It is January of 1888 in a mid-Atlantic harbor city called Harborside. In the air smells of coal smoke and boiled cabbage, a heavy, homey odor that clings to overcoats and hangs low over the river like a promise. The gas lights along Market Street sputter and throw small halos against the falling snow, and at first the flakes look like feathered confetti carried by a wind that does not yet mean trouble. You can hear the rattle of carriage wheels on cobbles, the metallic cough of the telegraph in the post office, and the distant clang of a factory bell, and it all feels ordinary enough to be trusted. People come and go in tenements with curtains half drawn, grocers sweep stoops, children make angels in the first soft drifts, and there is a domestic comfort in the smell of coal from kitchen stoves and the thin smoke threading up from chimneys. Someone hears a subtle, unfamiliar creak in a wooden awning and laughs it off. A telegraph operator reads a terse, formal line and sets his finger for the next click, none of them thinking that a few hours will make this ordinary evening into a long, white archive of memory that will be read as a series of letters and diaries for decades. If you like these reconstructions, like the video and tell us where you are watching from in the comments. Your voice becomes part of the living map. Now dim the lights, breathe in, and let the smell of coal and wet wool carry you into the city of that night. In the next minutes, you will hear diary entries, letters written by hand with shaky fingers, newspaper clippings, and the voices of people who waded through a storm that revealed curious old traps and new legends about how a city keeps itself alive. The day begins with a calm that feels fragile, as if the city is a glass ornament balanced on an unsteady shelf. Harborside is alive with domestic rhythms that will soon be exposed as vulnerable. At dawn, bakers wheel hot bread from their ovens, the scent of fresh crust meeting the coal smoke outside. Milk floaters and a milkman named Thomas Reed, small bell in hand, call the names of customers as he sets bottles at doorsteps. Sister Mary O'Neill runs a boarding house on Pine Street, where migrants and widows share a stove for warmth and gossip. Inside the tenement on 17 Shipwright Lane, Eleanor Price trims the lamp chimney and hums a hymn while her two small boys chase one another around a table piled with holly. Across town, Captain Horace Briggs at the ferry office checks the tide charts and the telegrams about the shipping lanes closed by ice. Each of these routines is ordinary and reassuring, but each also has invisible seams. The chimneys are old, their brick laid in an age when inspection was lax. The telegraph wires are a web of patched copper strung between holes that sometimes moan. The city depends on coal deliveries that come in narrow windows, and a delay leaves stoves out of fuel. In the market, a grocer, Ada Whitman, marks a ledger and jokes with a customer about how the river looks like a sheet of pewter. And yet, she notes with a small frown that her last delivery of coal arrived wet, heavier with ice. The first small warnings are fragmentary, the kinds of things people tuck away. A telegraph key that sticks for a moment, an awning that sags under a wet drape of snow. The carrier pigeons in a row that seem restless. An editor at the Harborside Herald files a short note about coastal squalls, and a diary entry by Jonas Klein, dated January 10, reads, "I have a strange feeling in my hands today, as though the winter wants something from us." These minute observations will become clues. By mid-morning, the signals gather into a clearer pattern. Weather notes arrive from the lighthouse keeper at East Point in telegram form, brief and clinical, reporting a sharp northerly shift, sudden pressure falls, and an unusual moisture in the air that freezes on contact. The harbor registers ice forming in eddies, ferries scraping like reluctant beasts. A physician at St. Agatha Hospital, Ezra Cole, reads the telegram and rubs his jaw, thinking of his elderly patients with coal stoves that sputter in the night. The post office fills with letters, and a nervous local paper prints a small column about an approaching blizzard, using the word blizzard as if trying a new instrument. People exchange small dialogues that taste of worry and routine. "Will the coal last?" asks Miriam Stein to Ada Whitman in the market. "Until Saturday, maybe, if the supply truck gets through," Ada replies, tapping the ledger with a flour-dusted finger. "Tell Mrs. Price to bring her boys to the church if the furnace goes out," says a volunteer from the parish, and the volunteer's eyes flick toward the river, where a brown line of temperature could become a drift the size of a wall. The city's telegraph lines begin to gather odd static, a sibilant cough that the operators write down as a curiosity. Backstory pauses appear, and now it is time to meet Eleanor Price, who will stand at the center of the story in a way neither she nor anyone around her could have foreseen. Eleanor grew up on the outer side of Harborside, a child of a fisherman and a schoolteacher, learning the smell of salt and ink. As a girl, she carried letters across docks, memorizing the grammar of tides and weather, and by the time she was a young woman, she had a precise way of measuring a storm by the scratch of gulls and the way her mother tightened the shutter. She married young and lost a baby to fever. That loss marked her with a tenderness that made her keep a little spare blanket folded in the bottom drawer for strangers. She learned to patch coal sacks and mend the sleeve of a coat with the same hands that later held diaries while reading aloud to neighbors during blackouts. Her present life is a small household in a tenement, living by a modest seamstress wage and tending 2 boys with a fierce economy of love. Her childhood memory of a winter when their father, a fisherman, failed to return sits like a pebble in her chest and informs every decision she makes now about whether to sleep or to stand watch. The secondary protagonist, Captain Horace Briggs, is a man of leathered face and precise charts, once a sea captain whose vessel was taken by a storm off Cape Mercy, an event that cost him his first mate and taught him that weather is both map and memory. His backstory comprises a widowed marriage, a stubborn belief in schedules, and a private notebook of barometric readings that he keeps like a talisman. He will collide with Eleanor's world when the city begins to close in on itself under snow. The first real signs of menace arrive like a chorus of small betrayals. The blizzard that everyone thought would be ordinary gathers in an unusual constellation. Snow falls with a wind that swings the flakes so they flatten against building faces, seeking cracks and seams. The city learns a new language of drift. Mail carriage routes stop in odd places because the horses are tired and hooves slip in ice. Telegraph messages arrive in clipped fragments, a few symbols lost. And reports of a drift forming at the mouth of Little Creek arrive like an overlooked note. In the Herald, a front-page columnist writes of roads turning to white tunnels, and in the municipal archive, a clerk files the first formal request to close schools. Outside, people begin to notice the small-town traps that winter exploits. An alleyway becomes a tunnel when snow piles under a stoop and forms a roof. Chimneys clog with rime, and smoke backs into rooms, carrying the stench of coal and the faint phantom of something sweeter, like burning hair. In one small scene, a conversation among workers at the telegraph exchange lengthens into a scene of human detail. "The key stuck again at 9, says Samuel, pausing to rub his numb fingers. "I thought it was the damn wiring, not the weather," replies Thomas, the senior operator. "It is the weather," says a younger operator, Jonah, and the sea figures into it. The water hits cold and the wires carry ice like a chain. They trade practical measures, wrapping cloth around fragile joints, but there is also talk of rumor, of stories about the old storm of 1856 when carriages vanished in drifts and a whole block was buried for days. A letter appears in the Herald from a reader in the North End, signed only with initials, that speaks of tunnels forming under snow, of entire rows of chimney flues blocked for weeks, and people rescued with pancakes thin as skin. The sense of scale moves upward. This is not a neighborhood problem. It is an event that will test the city and how it distributes coal, keeps telegraphs alive, and, most importantly, cares for those who live in fragile tenements. Then the storm really moves in, and the city experiences what feels like an explosion of white. The wind sets up a rough soprano along streets, a sound of grit and tension that carries the staccato rhythm of shutter slamming. Snow arrives in a brutal sheet, and soon drifts pile waist-high in doorways. Carriages become masts of a frozen fleet, stranded in avenues turned into channels. A ferry, delayed by ice, sounds its horn like a mechanical cry from across the river. The first big tragedy is small in human scale, but enormous in symbolism. A block of tenements on Market Lane loses its chimney draft to a cold, sticky rime, and smoke presses into rooms, waking people with coughing and panic. Eleanor wakes to the cough of her youngest and the smell of burnt wood. She lifts the boys and fumbles for matches. She looks out and finds the street swallowed in a whited blur, her neighbors wrapped in shawls that look like small islands. The scene expands and then cuts to the telegraph office, where Captain Horace receives a terse and desperate telegram about the ferry that has been iced in, stuck between piers with passengers aboard. The dialogue scenes now intensify, with exchanges that run long and layered, a woven mesh of voices that show the human decisions under stress. At the ferry office, a clerk and the captain discuss options. "We cannot leave them," says Harriet, the clerk, voice shaking. "We will try a rescue boat," Horace replies, "but the ice takes men like nets." "We could use the rope pulleys from the docks," suggests Mateo Alvarez, a volunteer who has run rescue lines before. "They are frozen," notes Ezra, "and the men aboard will be freezing through the night. We need a plan and a way to warm them." "Tell the harbor watch to fire the coal stove more," Harriet says. "We have blankets at St. Agatha, and Sister Mary will open the church." "Send a telegram to the captain on the vessel," Horace says. "Tell him to keep steam up if possible, and I will take the cutter." "What about the barge?" Mateo asks. "Try it, but expect breaking ice and a risk of splintering." "Then we will stagger men along a line," Harriet says, "one at a time, and pray." These are 14 exchanges of quick orders, plans, hesitations, and human tenderness. The captain's voice carries a trained calm over the crackle of the exchange, and the whole room smells of coal, oil, and wet wool. The rescue that follows is technical and terrifying, a rope and pulley system run over a drifting sheet of ice. Men stepping into holes cut by chisels, a sequence of pushes and pulls that is methodical yet mortal. The mechanism of rescue deserves a technical explanation. It involves stringing a hawser line across unstable ice, securing anchors at points cleared for weight, and using a block and tackle to move men and blankets. Each anchor must be hammered into sound timber or stone and shored with heavy bags of coal to prevent pulling free. The process is slow, requiring men to watch for brash ice movement and to relieve one another to prevent fatigue. It is work that takes precise timing and a coarse patience. In roughly 300 characters, the process can be summarized as follows, with measured detail. Secure an anchor point. Lay a hawser line with slack to absorb ice shift. Use block and tackle to transfer weight across moving ice. Relieve crew frequently to avoid hypothermia. Warm survivors immediately on rescue. The technical description is concise, but the human drama around it is long and messy. Mateo volunteers and steps into the cutter with greasy hands and a shawl over his head, and the cutter, lurching, finds a channel among the brash. On shore, a volunteer line is formed, and Sister Mary and Miriam unpack blankets and hot broth. The first rescued passengers are thin and white-lipped. One elderly woman murmurs a line from a letter she had been writing on the boat, a love note to a husband ashore. Those individual, tender details will be recorded in at least 2 primary sources later: a diary by a rescued man named Samuel Reed, and a letter published in the Harborside Herald under the headline, "Saved from the Ice." While rescue efforts unfold, other parts of the city go into a state of enforced survival. Streets become tunnels of drift, where the wind cuts and the light is a memory. People adopt inventive ways to get basic supplies. Thomas Reed, the milkman, pushes a sled of milk jars and wraps them in burlap, and his shoes fill with slush as he returns. Ada Whitman transforms her grocery into a distribution hub, rationing flour into small paper sacks and trading with neighbors who bring wood. Inside the tenements, the stove is everything. It is hearth, consolation, and danger. Smoke backs when chimneys cannot draw, and people begin to check on older neighbors by peering into windows and calling out names. A secondary thread develops around a blocked underpass that becomes both shelter and trap. A group of laborers, including Jonah and Ezra, shove and break snow to create a passage for stranded carts, and in so doing, they reveal an old subterranean stream that had been long since vaulted over. The stream, now partially exposed and frozen, undercuts the street and forms a dangerous cavity. "Watch your step," warns Jonah, as the ground gives a sigh and a pocket of air shivers. "There are old tunnels under this city," Ezekiel, an old mason, says. "We built over waterways and forgot their temper." This moment reveals how urban memory lives beneath pavement, how the city can carry secrets like water under ice. Backstories are woven into the survival days in ways that show character depth. Eleanor's inner life is shown in 3 small sensorial paragraphs that total roughly 900 characters. She remembers her father teaching her to tie a knot by the windward side of a boat so the knot would not slip. The smell of his tobacco that always read as sea to her. The night he did not come back, and a hand of men held up his empty coat on the pier like a flag. She remembers the ledger of stitches she keeps, the tiny repair on her boy's boot that took more thought than the dress she mended for a wedding, and the lullabies that her mother hummed when the coal supply ran low and the house grew thin with cold. In the present, those memories become practical. She knows how to patch ribs of a sled, how to put extra coals under a pot to simmer broth for neighbors, and how to write a line of instruction on a scrap of paper that might be read by someone else when she is away. Captain Horace's backstory, roughly 700 characters, shows his sea scars, the list of ports he has watched, and the time he chose to risk a lee shore to save a merchant's cargo, a decision that cost him a first mate but taught him to measure a storm not as a single event but as a set of shifting choices. That stoic practice of weighing risk becomes his role now. Secondary characters also have small arcs. Mateo Alvarez is a dock worker with a wife who runs a bakery. He carries the smell of dough in his pockets, and he has a history of volunteer rescues. Miriam Stein is a seamstress whose brother was lost to fever and who keeps a ledger of names she checks every night. Ada Whitman inherited her grocery from an uncle who taught her to value credit extended to those with small work. Jonah Klein is a young operator with a nervous laugh and a clean, precise handwriting he uses when writing letters for older neighbors. As the days of confinement extend, human improvisation becomes the city's primary economy. People take to making soup kitchens in church basements, and volunteers coordinate in rough committees. The voice of a volunteer named Ezra Cole expands into leadership as he organizes teams for food, warmth, and medical attention. The dialogues that emerge in these scenes are expanded conversations with 8 to 10 turns showing negotiation, compassion, and exhaustion. In a long scene at St. Agatha Church, Sister Mary and volunteers coordinate. "Bring the stoves in from the vestry," Sister Mary instructs. "We have coal but not enough manpower," says Mateo. "We will set up relay lines for fuel," says Miriam, "rope the sleds and put watchmen at the corners. Pass word to the tenements on Fish Alley," says Ada. "I will go," offers Thomas, "but my boy needs tending." "Bring him," Sister Mary answers. "We will care for him here, and you will help with the lanterns." "The lanterns fog in this weather," Mateo notes. "We must shield them," says Sister Mary. "Paint glass with tallow if you must." "And the sick?" asks Ezra in a hushed voice. "We will triage in the back room. Make beds out of pew cushions," Sister Mary replies. "Take this list and ring the bell for names," Miriam says. "We will call them in small groups," says Ada. "No crowding." This exchange shows both the practical measures and the small moral choices that define communal survival. In the thick of the storm, myths and legends begin to sprout where reality is thin. People recall an old story about snow castles, barns where wind piled snow into towers so tall that children could play within their vaulted rooms. And people whisper of a myth that those who could find the hidden threshold of a snow castle would be spared from the worst of winter. It is a kind of comforting fairy tale that some use to encourage children to keep warm, but in the storm it takes on a different cast. A group of boys build a makeshift fort in a drift that resembles a ruined castle, and there, wrapped in old blankets, they hear an older man recite a portion from a diary found in a wooden trunk. January 17th. The snow built ramparts around our door, and I thought we had returned to a world of ice palaces. That diary entry will be quoted in later municipal reports and left in the municipal archive. The emergence of such stories helps people frame the storm in meaning, a psychological shelter in addition to the physical ones. At the same time, the city is forced to admit structural fragilities. The hospital reports increased respiratory issues caused by closed chimneys and the use of alternative heating methods, some of which cause small house fires. The municipal council debates whether to establish a more reliable coal reserve and whether to alter chimney codes, an early inkling of policy that will later change infrastructure. The rescue operations and volunteer networks produce moments of tension with complex moral decisions. In one particular crisis, a block of boarding houses on Lower Wharf begins to slump as underlying soil freezes and shifts. The foundation of a 3-story tenement, known as the Garnet boarding house, slips into a shallow sink of cold water that undermines the brick. People are inside. There is a question of who to evacuate first and whether to risk cutting a support beam that could topple the rest. The moment expands into 2 long paragraphs of inner conflict and decisive action, totaling roughly 600 characters. Eleanor stands at the front, hearing the creak and feeling a memory of her father at the bow of his small boat. She must decide whether to enter and lift an elderly woman from an upper room or to coordinate from below with ropes, knowing that care will take time. Her mind races through childhood training with ropes and her memory of the old storm when a neighbor left a child in a room to fetch a ladder and never returned. She chooses the rope line and the plan to lower the elderly woman first, a decision that tests both her courage and her knowledge of knots. This scene shows a blend of internal recollection and an active decision that leads to small rescue success and a haunting cost, a necessary compromise in a city under pressure. As thaw edges toward attention, the city begins the slow work of recovery. Streets unmute like a buried orchestra. The thaw is unpredictable, shifting between a soft melting that reveals muffled sounds and sudden icy torrents that break unseen dams. Men and women clear roofs with hooks, gutters flowing with slush. The logistics of recovery require a mixture of municipal organization and grassroots improvisation. The municipal engineer proposes a staged plan to clear major arteries first, bring coal to the worst off, and survey structural damage. The technical description of survey procedures needs clarity and, in compact terms, may be described like this, in 290 characters. Measure subsidence using plumb lines and simple jack posts. Mark and cordon unsafe buildings. Prioritize arteries by population density. Create temporary ramps for carriages, and coordinate with volunteer brigades for food distribution. The engineer's plan is pragmatic and dry, while the volunteers bring heat and immediate human response. The thaw encourages small acts of generosity. Ada Whitman opens her store as a distribution point. Captain Horace lends a tugboat to clear floating brash. And Sister Mary organizes a roster so houses can be checked twice a day. The city begins to redefine normality with an emphasis on mutual aid. Consequences reach into city institutions and into debate. The council meets in a long session and hears testimony from citizens, reports from the Herald, and an archive clerk who reads diary entries aloud to the council. The debate turns to policy. Should Harborside establish a municipal coal reserve, mandate chimney inspections, change the building code to inspect foundations near waterways, and install winter watch brigades? The arguments are sometimes analytic, even sardonic, as local merchants worry about costs and politicians worry about votes. If we do not invest in reserves now, says a physician at the meeting, we invite failure. A councillor replies that citizens must show personal responsibility, and another member points to the cost of shoring up foundations. The hearings reference 2 primary sources, a diary entry from a Providence mariner and a letter to the Herald from a widow on River Row, and those documents shape public feeling. The outcome is messy compromise. The council moves to form a small fund for coal reserves and to trial a winter watch brigade, led by Captain Horace, and they assign an engineer to inspect key bridges and sewer mouths come spring. The changes are incremental but foundational. The city learns institutions can be reactive, and that the test of civic will is in what gets funded after the memory of calamity begins to cool. In the months that follow, the story moves into an extended epilogue that traces consequences at 1 month, 3 months, and 6 months, reflecting how memory, policy, and personal lives evolve. 1 month later, the city still smells of damp coal and wet wool, but the larger shocks have been softened. People have named those who helped. The Herald publishes a list of volunteers and an extract of the rescued diaries. The municipal archive receives a donation of a trunk filled with letters and a sailor's diary, and the community organizes a small memorial service in the square. The municipal coal fund is modest but symbolic. Sister Mary oversees distributions, and the parish sees increased enrollment in night classes about home safety. People speak more carefully about chimneys and ropes. 3 months later, the thaw has allowed engineers to survey the damage. Some tenements are condemned, and a handful of families relocate to other neighborhoods. A new ordinance requiring inspection of chimneys before winter is debated at the council and then passed in a limited form. The volunteer brigades formalize into a winter watch with a small roster and training sessions in basic rescue and first aid. Eleanor has found work mending sails for a small boat owner and has joined the watch as a seamstress who also coordinates supplies. Captain Horace receives a commendation and is asked to write a short manual for winter harbor operations published by the Port Authority. 6 months on, Harborside has a different rhythm. The municipal archive publishes a small pamphlet of letters and diary extracts to remind citizens of those long nights, including a copy of an elderly woman's letter that reads, "We were cold and we were scared, and then hands came," and that memory has a clean, simple moral for the city. Legally, the city adopts a more robust code for chimneys and creates a standing reserve of coal that is rotated and inventoried. Socially, neighbors who once had only polite connections now share soup recipes and coal connections. The long-term legacy is a civic ethic that values shared resources, and in another season, the children who once played in snow castles will look back at how the city learned to read its weather and repair its memory. In the quieter final pages of this recorded evening, there are lessons about myth and technique, about how a storm can reveal both traps and treasures of urban life. The snow-covered city is like a set of castles, each drift revealing an old seam of the city, a hidden tunnel, a story of neglect or care. The archives retain letters, 2 of which I have used as primary sources in this telling, one a diary found in a rescued trunk, and the other a letter printed in the Harborside Herald. They are the raw materials of memory, the voices that carry forward the texture of that winter. The final reflection returns to the first image, the smell of coal and boiled cabbage, the small courage of people like Eleanor, Captain Horace, Ada, Mateo, Miriam, Samuel, Jonah, and Sister Mary, who together turned fear into a pattern of care. The city that began that pale evening with soft gaslight and carriage wheels ended with shared stoves and a practical set of reforms. If this story moved you, subscribe for more reconstructed nights and share it with someone who keeps a lantern through storms. Thank you for joining this walk through a winter that taught Harborside how to look for danger, how to build small rescues, and how legends and technical work together to save lives.